Have you ever noticed how even the most faithful believers can lie awake at 3 a.m., their minds racing with tomorrow's worries? You're not alone. In fact, Scripture shows us that anxiety touched the hearts of giants of faith, from King David to the Apostle Paul. But here's what's remarkable. Each of them discovered something transformative about God's presence that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. Today, we're diving into 3 profound biblical narratives that reveal a divine pattern, a sacred rhythm that moves from storm to surrender to stillness. This isn't just another message about don't worry. This is about discovering why Jesus could sleep peacefully in a boat during a life-threatening storm, and how that same peace can become yours. What you're about to learn could fundamentally shift how you face your anxious thoughts tonight. These aren't mere ancient stories. They're living blueprints for supernatural peace in our chaotic world. By the end of this video, you'll understand why anxiety loses its grip when we truly grasp what it means to dwell in God's presence. Before we begin, comment below. His peace guards my heart if you're ready to experience this transformation. And if this message speaks to you, subscribe and join our community seeking God's deep peace together. Let's journey from the storm into His perfect stillness. Let's begin by looking at 3 moments in Scripture where anxiety took hold of people just like you and me. These aren't stories about weak faith. They're about real people facing real storms, both in their hearts and in their circumstances. We'll see Martha overwhelmed by her responsibilities, Peter sinking in fear, and experienced fishermen terrified by a storm. Each story shows us something vital about how anxiety works in our hearts. The sun was already high when Jesus and His disciples arrived at the village. Martha saw them coming down the dusty road, and her heart jumped with both joy and panic. Jesus was coming to her house. There was so much to do. In Luke chapter 10, starting at verse 38, we read exactly what happened. As Jesus and His disciples were on their way, He came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to Him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what He said. Picture this scene. Mary simply walked into the room and sat down right there at Jesus' feet. She didn't ask if the water jars were filled. She didn't check if there was enough bread. She just sat down and listened. Her eyes were fixed on Jesus, drinking in every word He spoke. But Martha? The Scripture tells us in verse 40, "But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made." That word, distracted, paints such a clear picture. Martha's mind was pulled in 1,000 directions. The bread needed baking. The floor needed sweeping. Were there enough cushions for everyone to sit? Did someone refill the water jars? Each task pulled at her attention, like children tugging at their mother's robe. She moved from room to room, her movements getting quicker, more frantic. Through the doorway, she could see Mary still sitting there, not moving, not helping. The frustration built in Martha's chest like steam in a covered pot. How could Mary just sit there when there was so much work to be done? Finally, Martha couldn't take it anymore. She burst into the room where Jesus was teaching. The disciples probably looked up, startled. But Martha didn't care about interrupting. In verse 40, we see her exact words. "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." Listen to the frustration in those words. Don't you care? She was essentially saying, Jesus, don't you see what's happening here? Don't you see how unfair this is? I'm drowning in all these tasks while Mary just sits there. But Jesus' response changed everything. Verse 41 and 42 record His gentle but firm words. "Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, But few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Notice how Jesus said her name twice. Martha, Martha. There's such tenderness in that repetition, like a parent gently calling a child who's having a meltdown. He saw her. He understood her stress. But he also saw something Martha couldn't see in that moment. He said she was worried and upset about many things. The Greek word used here for worried means to be pulled apart, to be divided. Martha's mind was literally being pulled in different directions by all her concerns. The meal, the preparations, the hosting duties. Each one was pulling a piece of her attention away from what truly mattered. And then Jesus revealed the heart of the problem. But few things are needed, or indeed only one. What was that one thing? It was what Mary had chosen, to sit at Jesus' feet and listen. Mary understood something that Martha had missed. When the creator of the universe is sitting in your living room, the dust on the shelves doesn't matter. When the bread of life is speaking, you don't need to worry about having enough food. Martha's anxiety came from good intentions. She wanted to serve Jesus well. She wanted to be a good host. These weren't bad desires. But in her pursuit of serving Jesus, she had missed Jesus himself. She was so busy working for him that she forgot to be with him. Think about how this happens in your own life. You wake up with a mental list already forming. Get the kids ready, make breakfast, answer those emails, pay that bill, call your mother, fix that thing that's been broken for weeks. Each task seems important. Each one demands attention. And somewhere in all that busyness, you realize you haven't stopped to breathe. You haven't sat still. You've been moving from task to task like Martha moved from room to room, getting more frustrated and anxious with each passing hour. The daily responsibilities pile up like dishes in the sink. And just like Martha watching Mary sit while she worked, you might look at others and wonder why they seem so peaceful while you're drowning. You might even find yourself saying to God, "Don't you care that I'm overwhelmed? Don't you see all that I have to handle?" But Jesus' words to Martha echo through the centuries to us. You're worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is truly needed. That one thing isn't another task to add to your list. It's not another responsibility to juggle. It's choosing to stop, to sit, to listen. It's recognizing that your peace doesn't come from having everything done. It comes from being with the one who holds everything together. Martha thought peace would come when all the preparations were complete, when the food was ready, when the house was clean, when everything was perfect. Then she could relax. But Jesus showed her that peace was already available. It was sitting right there in her living room, teaching anyone who would listen. The night was dark, and the Sea of Galilee was rough. The disciples had been rowing for hours, fighting against the wind. Their arms burned with exhaustion. Water splashed over the sides of the boat, and they were still far from shore. Matthew chapter 14, verse 22 sets the scene. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Notice that detail. Jesus made them get into the boat. He sent them into this storm. They didn't stumble into this difficulty by accident. Jesus knew the wind would be against them. He knew they would struggle. Yet he sent them anyway. The fourth watch of the night came. That's between 3 and 6 in the morning. They had been fighting these waves all night long. Their hands were probably raw from gripping the oars. Their backs ached. And then, through the spray and the darkness, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Verse 25 and 26 tell us, "Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost,' they said, and cried out in fear. Imagine being in that boat. You're already exhausted, already on edge from fighting the storm all night. Then you see a figure walking where no human should be able to walk, on top of the churning waves. These grown men, these tough fishermen, cried out in fear." The Greek word used here means they shrieked, they screamed in terror, but immediately, and that word immediately is important, Jesus spoke to them. Verse 27, "But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage. It is I, don't be afraid.'" In the middle of their terror, Jesus' voice cut through the wind and the fear. "It is I." In Greek, he literally said, "I am," the same name God used when speaking to Moses. The very voice that spoke creation into existence was now speaking peace into their chaos. And then Peter did something extraordinary. Verse 28 and 29. "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Think about this moment. Peter was asking to do the impossible. He wasn't asking for the storm to stop. He wasn't asking to be transported safely to shore. He was asking to walk on water, to do what only Jesus was doing. And Jesus said one word, "Come." The scripture continues. "Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. Peter swung his legs over the side of the boat. His feet touched the water, and instead of sinking, he found it solid beneath him. Can you imagine that first step? The water that should have swallowed him held him up. He took another step, then another. He was actually walking on water. His eyes were locked on Jesus. Each step was impossible, yet each step held. The same waves that had been threatening to sink their boat were now a pathway under his feet. The other disciples watched in amazement as Peter did what no human had ever done before. But then verse 30 shows us what happened. "But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, 'Lord, save me,' when he saw the wind." He took his eyes off Jesus and looked at the circumstances. He noticed the size of the waves. He felt the force of the wind. He remembered that humans don't walk on water. And the moment his focus shifted from Christ to the chaos around him, he began to sink. The water that had been solid beneath his feet suddenly gave way. He was going down. The waves that had held him up were now pulling him under. And in that moment of pure terror, Peter cried out the most honest prayer in Scripture, "Lord, save me." 3 words. No fancy religious language, no trying to explain or bargain, just the raw, desperate cry of someone who knew he was drowning. Verse 31. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" Again, that word immediately. Jesus didn't let Peter sink to teach him a lesson. He didn't wait for Peter to try harder. The moment Peter cried out, Jesus was there, his hand extended, pulling him up. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" This wasn't harsh condemnation. This was a gentle question. Peter had faith. He got out of the boat. But his faith wavered when he shifted his focus. He had been walking on water, doing the impossible, held up by nothing but trust in Jesus' word. But when he started analyzing the situation, when he started looking at the very real danger around him, doubt crept in. Think about your own life. How many times have you started something in faith, eyes fixed on Jesus, only to look around at the circumstances and feel yourself starting to sink? You take that step of faith. Maybe it's starting a new job, making a difficult decision, or trusting God with a relationship. At first, you're walking on water. You're doing it. You're trusting. But then you notice the wind. You see the bills that need paying. You hear the criticism from others. You feel the weight of responsibility. You remember all the times things didn't work out before, and suddenly, what felt solid beneath your feet starts to give way. The fear that grips you in those moments is the same fear that gripped Peter. It's the fear that comes when we realize we're in over our heads, when we remember that what we're attempting is actually impossible without God. And just like Peter, our response in those moments is often that same desperate cry, "Lord, save me." It's not theological, it's not sophisticated, it's just the honest acknowledgement that we're sinking and we need Him. The beautiful thing is that Jesus responds to that cry the same way He responded to Peter, immediately. His hand is always ready to catch us. He doesn't lecture us about our lack of faith while we're drowning. He saves first, then gently asks, "Why did you doubt?" Verse 32 tells us what happened next. And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. The storm that had been raging all night, the wind that had been against them for hours, suddenly stopped. The sea became calm. But notice when this happened, after the test of faith, after Peter's attempt and failure, after Jesus' rescue. The storm served its purpose. It revealed their fear, tested their faith, and ultimately led them to a deeper understanding of who Jesus was. Verse 33 shows us their response. Then those who were in the boat worshipped Him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." They had seen Jesus do miracles before, but something about this night, this storm, this display of power over nature itself brought them to a new level of recognition. They worshipped Him. They declared His divine identity. Peter's anxiety in this story is so relatable. He started strong, full of faith and courage, but the moment he shifted his focus from Jesus to the problems around him, fear took over. The wind didn't get stronger when Peter started sinking. He just started noticing it more. The waves didn't get bigger. He just started measuring himself against them instead of measuring them against Jesus' power. The day had been long and full of teaching. Crowds had pressed in from every side, hungry for Jesus' words. Now, as evening approached, Jesus looked at His disciples and said something unexpected. Mark chapter 4, verse 35, records His words. That day when evening came, He said to His disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." It seemed like a simple request. Cross the Sea of Galilee. They'd done it many times before. Several of them were professional fishermen who knew these waters like the back of their hands. Peter, Andrew, James, and John had spent their whole lives on this lake. Verse 36 continues. Leaving the crowd behind, they took Him along, just as He was, in the boat. There were also other boats with Him. Notice that detail, just as He was. Jesus was exhausted from a full day of ministry. He didn't prepare for the journey. He didn't pack supplies or check the weather. He simply got in the boat, trusting His disciples' expertise with sailing. Then verse 37 hits us with sudden intensity. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. This wasn't a gentle rain. This wasn't normal rough water. The Greek word used here describes a violent windstorm, like a hurricane. The Sea of Galilee was known for these sudden storms. Cool air would rush down from the surrounding mountains and clash with the warm air over the water, creating violent tempests that appeared out of nowhere. But this storm was different. Mark calls it a great storm, something beyond what even these experienced fishermen had seen. The waves weren't just splashing into the boat, they were breaking over it. The boat was filling with water faster than they could bail it out. These men who had spent their lives on the water were now facing something beyond their experience. Their skills weren't enough. Their knowledge wasn't helping. The boat was nearly swamped. It was going down. And where was Jesus during all this? Verse 38 gives us an almost unbelievable picture. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. While his disciples were fighting for their lives, while water was flooding the boat, while death seemed moments away, Jesus was sleeping. Not just dozing, but sound asleep on a cushion in the back of the boat. How could he sleep through this? The boat was being tossed like a toy. Water was pouring in. The disciples were shouting over the wind, probably calling out instructions to each other, trying desperately to keep the boat afloat. And Jesus slept through it all. The disciples finally reached their breaking point. Verse 38 continues, "The disciples woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, don't you care if we drown?'" Feel the desperation in that question. Don't you care? They weren't just asking for help. They were questioning his concern for them. How could he sleep while they were about to die? Didn't he care that they were terrified? Didn't he care that water was filling the boat? Didn't he care that they were all about to drown? It's the same question Martha asked when she was overwhelmed with preparations. It's the same question we ask when life feels out of control. God, don't you care? Don't you see what's happening? Don't you notice that I'm drowning here? But then Jesus did something that changed everything. Verse 39. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Jesus spoke to the storm like it was a disobedient child. He rebuked it. The word used here is the same word he used when casting out demons. He commanded the wind and waves with absolute authority, and they obeyed instantly. Quiet, be still. In Greek, it literally means be silent, be muzzled, like telling a barking dog to stop. And immediately, not gradually, not slowly, the wind died down. The waves flattened. The sea became completely calm. One moment, chaos. The next moment, perfect peace. One moment, the disciples were fighting for survival. The next, they were sitting in a boat on a sea as smooth as glass. But Jesus wasn't done. Verse 40. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" These weren't accusations. They were questions meant to make them think. Why are you so afraid? He wasn't asking for information. He was highlighting something. They had seen him heal the sick, cast out demons, and teach with authority. They had left everything to follow him. Yet here they were, terrified, as if he had no power over this situation. Do you still have no faith? After everything they had witnessed, after all the miracles, they still didn't understand who was in the boat with them. They had more faith in the storm's power to destroy them than in Jesus' power to save them. The disciples' response in verse 41 reveals their stunned realization. They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Notice something interesting. They were terrified after the storm was calmed. They had been afraid of the storm, but now they were terrified of Jesus. They had just witnessed something that challenged everything they understood about reality. These fishermen knew the sea. They knew that storms don't just stop instantly. They knew that waves don't flatten on command. They knew that no human could speak to the wind and be obeyed. Yet they had just watched Jesus do exactly that. Who is this? It's the most important question they could ask. They thought they knew him, teacher, rabbi, healer. But this was something else entirely. The forces of nature that had threatened to kill them moments ago had submitted to his voice like servants to a master. Think about what this means for your own storms. The disciples made a common mistake. They measured the size of their problem against their own ability to handle it. They were experienced sailors, but this storm was beyond their expertise. They had skills and knowledge, but the waves were too big, the wind too strong. They forgot who was in the boat with them. The one who spoke the universe into existence was taking a nap in their stern. The one who separated the waters in creation was sleeping through their crisis. Not because he didn't care, but because no storm could threaten him. Jesus could sleep because he knew something the disciples had forgotten. He had authority over everything that threatened them. The storm that terrified them was subject to him. The waves that filled their boat moved at his permission. The wind that drove them toward disaster would stop the instant he commanded it. When Jesus asked, "Why are you so afraid?" he was really asking, "Have you forgotten who I am? Have you forgotten that I'm in this boat with you?" The storm was real. The danger was real. The water filling the boat was real. But none of it was more real than Jesus' authority. None of it was stronger than his power. None of it was beyond his control. The disciples were paralyzed by an unprecedented storm because they were looking at it through human eyes. They saw the size of the waves and knew their boat couldn't handle it. They felt the force of the wind and knew their sails couldn't withstand it. They saw the water rising and knew they couldn't bail fast enough. But Jesus saw the same storm and took a nap, because he knew what they were still learning, that he had authority over everything that could threaten them. The storm might be unprecedented in their experience, but it was nothing new to the one who controls the wind and waves. Your storms might be unprecedented in your experience too. You might be facing something you've never dealt with before, something that your skills and knowledge can't handle. You might be looking at the rising water in your boat and knowing you can't bail fast enough, but the same Jesus who was in that boat is with you in yours. The same voice that commanded, "Quiet! Be still!" to those waves has authority over whatever is threatening to overwhelm you. The question he asked those disciples echoes across the centuries to us. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? The disciples' terror came from a very real place. They weren't being dramatic. They were actually about to sink. But their terror also revealed something. They had more confidence in the storm's ability to destroy them than in Jesus' ability to save them. They believed more in the power of the wind and waves than in the power of the one who created wind and waves. Each of these three stories shows us something crucial about anxiety. Martha's worry came from good intentions gone wrong, serving becoming more important than being present. Peter's fear came when he shifted his focus from Jesus to his circumstances. The disciples' terror came from forgetting who was in their boat. In each case, the anxiety was real. The responsibilities Martha faced were real. The waves Peter saw were real. The storm threatening the disciples was real. But in each case, they had forgotten something more real, the presence and power of Jesus in their situation. Now we move from understanding our anxious hearts to something deeper, the moment of surrender. This is where real change begins. We'll witness three powerful moments of release. Hannah pouring out her bitterness until peace replaced her anguish. Abraham walking toward the unthinkable while trusting God's provision, and Paul discovering strength in accepting what he couldn't change. Each story reveals how surrendering control to God transforms us in ways we never expected. Year after year, the scene repeated itself. The family would pack their belongings and travel to Shiloh for the annual sacrifice. Year after year, Hannah would watch Peninnah's children running ahead on the path, their laughter echoing through the hills. And year after year, Hannah's arms remained empty. 1 Samuel chapter 1 tells us this painful story. Verse 2 introduces the situation. He had two wives. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. In that culture, a woman without children carried deep shame. Every month that passed without conception felt like another confirmation that God had forgotten her. and Peninnah made sure Hannah never forgot her barrenness. Verses 6 and 7 reveal the torment. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Peninnah's cruelty was calculated. She waited for the most sacred moments, the times when families celebrated together at God's house, to twist the knife deeper. When everyone else was rejoicing, Peninnah would make sure Hannah remembered what she lacked. Elkanah, Hannah's husband, loved her deeply. Verse 5 tells us, "But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb." He tried to comfort her, asking in verse 8, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" He meant well, but he couldn't understand. His love, though genuine, couldn't fill the aching void in Hannah's heart. The empty place at her table, the silence where children's voices should have been, the ache in her arms that longed to hold a baby. His love couldn't touch these places. This particular year at Shiloh, something shifted in Hannah. She couldn't take it anymore. The weight of years of disappointment, mockery, and unfulfilled longing had become unbearable. Verse 9 begins the turning point. Once, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. Hannah rose from the feast. She couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't sit there with a smile while her heart was breaking. She made her way to the temple, and there something remarkable happened. Verse 10 and 11 describe the moment. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." Hannah didn't hold back. She poured out everything, the bitterness, the anguish, the years of pain. The Hebrew word used here for deep anguish literally means bitter of soul. Every disappointed hope, every cruel word from Peninnah, every well-meaning but hurtful comment from others, it all came pouring out before God. But notice what happened in the middle of her prayer. She made a vow that seems almost impossible to understand. She was begging for a son, but in the same breath, promising to give him back to God. She wanted this child so desperately, yet she was already releasing him. This wasn't bargaining. This was surrender. Hannah was saying, "Lord, I want this more than anything, but I want your will more. I'll take the joy of bearing him and the pain of releasing him. I'll accept both the gift and the sacrifice." Verse 12 and 13 continue. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk. Her prayer was so intense, so deeply personal, that no words came out. Her lips moved with the force of her emotion, but the cry was too deep for sound. She wasn't performing religious duties. She wasn't reciting formal prayers. She was pouring out her soul like water before the Lord. Eli, watching from his seat, completely misread the situation. Verse 14, and said to her, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine." Imagine that moment. Hannah was in the most vulnerable place of prayer she'd ever been, and the priest accused her of being drunk. She could have been offended. She could have given up. But instead, she explained herself with remarkable composure. Verse 15 and 16. "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." She didn't defend herself angrily. She simply explained, "I'm not drunk, I'm desperate, I'm not wicked, I'm wounded. I've been pouring out my soul, literally emptying myself before God." Then Eli, finally understanding, spoke words that would change everything. Verse 17. Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." It wasn't a guarantee. Eli didn't say, "God will definitely give you a son." He simply blessed her request and sent her away in peace. But something had already shifted in Hannah's heart. The next verse reveals the transformation. Verse 18. She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Look at what changed. She ate. The woman who had been too grief-stricken to eat was now hungry. Her face was no longer downcast. The sorrow that had marked her features for years was gone. But notice, she hadn't received her answer yet. She wasn't pregnant. Her circumstances hadn't changed. Peninnah was still there with all her children. Hannah's womb was still closed. What changed was Hannah herself. In pouring out her bitterness, she had emptied herself of its poison. In releasing her deepest desire to God, even promising to give back what she wanted most, she had found peace. The surrender itself had freed her before the answer ever came. Verse 19 tells us, "Early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. They worshipped together, then returned to normal life. And in that normal life, in the ordinary rhythm of marriage, God moved. The Lord remembered her, not because he had forgotten, but because the time had come. Hannah's surrender had prepared her heart for both the gift and the sacrifice that would follow. Verse 20 confirms the miracle. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." Samuel, which sounds like the Hebrew for heard by God. Every time she spoke her son's name, Hannah would remember both her desperate prayer and God's gracious answer. But she would also remember her vow. When Samuel was weaned, probably around 3 years old, Hannah kept her promise. She brought her only child, the son she had wept for year after year, and gave him to the Lord's service. She left him at the temple with Eli, visiting him only once a year. Think about the strength that took. She had prayed for this child with more intensity than most people pray for anything. She had endured years of mockery and shame for his absence. And when God finally gave him to her, she gave him back. The surrender that began in her prayer was completed in her actions. But here's what's remarkable. Hannah's story doesn't end in loss. 1 Samuel 2:21 tells us, "And the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. The child she released to God became the prophet who would anoint kings. And God gave her 5 more children. Her surrender didn't leave her empty. It opened her to receive more than she had asked for. The call came in the night, clear and unmistakable. Genesis chapter 22, verse 1 and 2 record the moment that would test everything Abraham believed. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Every word of that command was carefully chosen to maximize the impossibility. Your son, the child of promise. Your only son, the one through whom all God's promises would come. Whom you love, acknowledging the deep Father's heart that would be shattered. Isaac, saying his name, making it personal. Abraham was over 100 years old. He had waited 25 years for this son. Isaac was the miracle child, the impossible made real, the laughter that had replaced decades of disappointment. And now God was asking for him back. The command made no sense. God had promised that through Isaac, Abraham would become the father of nations. How could those promises be fulfilled if Isaac died? How could God's word be true if the child of promise became a sacrifice? But verse 3 shows us Abraham's response. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son, Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. No argument, no negotiation, no requesting clarification. Abraham got up early and began preparing. He cut the wood himself, each stroke of the axe a reminder of what that wood was for. He loaded his donkey with supplies for a journey he wished he never had to make. He took Isaac and 2 servants and began walking. Can you imagine that first day? Isaac, probably a teenager, excited about a trip with his father. The servants, unaware of the true purpose. And Abraham, carrying a secret that was tearing him apart with every step. Verse 4. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. 3 days. 3 days of walking toward the unthinkable. 3 days of watching Isaac, memorizing his face, his laugh, the way he walked. 3 days of opportunity to turn back, to decide this was too much, to convince himself he had misheard. But Abraham kept walking. Each sunrise brought him closer to the mountain. Each night under the stars reminded him of God's promise, descendants as numerous as the stars. How could that promise survive what he was about to do? When they could see the mountain, Abraham made a decision. Verse 5. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Notice what he said. We will come back to you. Not, I will come back. We. Even walking toward this impossible sacrifice, Abraham held on to faith that somehow both he and Isaac would return. Hebrews 11:19 later tells us Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. If God required Isaac's life, but had also promised Isaac's future, then God would have to resurrect him. Verse 6 describes the climb. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac carried the wood for his own sacrifice, not knowing what he was bearing. Abraham carried the fire and the knife, the instruments of death in the hands of the Father. They walked together, but the weight Abraham carried was more than physical. Then came the question Abraham must have been dreading. Verse 7. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Feel the innocence in that question. Isaac understood worship. He knew they needed a sacrifice. He saw the wood, the fire, the knife, everything except the most important element. Where was the lamb? Abraham's answer in verse 8 carries layers of meaning. Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. Was this faith or deflection? Was Abraham prophesying without knowing it? God himself will provide. These words would prove truer than Abraham could have imagined. But in that moment, they were all he could offer his son. And the 2 of them went on together. The phrase repeats, emphasizing their unity, even as Abraham's heart was breaking. They climbed in silence now, Isaac perhaps puzzled but trusting his father, Abraham each step an act of anguished obedience. Verse 9. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. The moment had come. Abraham built the altar stone by stone, each rock a weight added to his heart. He arranged the wood, the same wood Isaac had carried up the mountain. And then, the text is sparse here, giving no dialogue, he bound his son. What did Isaac think in that moment? Did he struggle? Did he submit? The text doesn't say, but Isaac was young and strong enough to carry wood up a mountain. Abraham was over 100 years old. If Isaac had resisted, the old man couldn't have overcome him. The silence suggests submission, the son trusting the father even unto death. Abraham laid Isaac on the altar. His son, his only son, whom he loved, was now lying on the wood, bound, waiting. This was the absolute surrender, not just words, not just promises, but action that would be irreversible. Verse 10. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Abraham's hand gripped the knife. He raised it. The blade caught the sunlight. In seconds, it would all be over. 25 years of waiting, a lifetime of promises, the laughter and joy Isaac had brought, all of it would end with one downward motion. But verse 11 and 12 record the intervention. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. The voice came at the last possible moment. Not when Abraham was building the altar, not when he was binding Isaac, but when the knife was raised, when the commitment was complete, when there was no question about Abraham's surrender. Now I know that you fear God. The test was complete. Abraham had held nothing back. He had surrendered what was most precious, what was irreplaceable, what was the very promise of God incarnate in his life. Verse 13. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. The ram was already there, caught in the thicket. God had provided the substitute before Abraham ever raised the knife. The provision was present even while Abraham was climbing the mountain in anguish. But Abraham couldn't see it until after his surrender was complete. Verse 14. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide, not the Lord has provided. Past tense, or the Lord provides, present tense, but the Lord will provide, future tense. Abraham's experience taught him that God's provision appears at the exact moment it's needed, not before, but never too late. The 3-day journey, the silent climb, the raised knife, all of it was necessary for Abraham to discover this truth. He couldn't have learned it any other way. The surrender had to be complete for the provision to be revealed. Paul had seen the third heaven. He had been caught up into paradise itself, hearing things too sacred for human words. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 2 through 4, describe this extraordinary experience. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. Paul was speaking about himself in the third person, but he was describing his own experience. He had seen what no living person should see. He had heard what no human ears should hear. He had been given revelations that surpassed anything given to the other apostles. But with this extraordinary privilege came an unwelcome companion. Verse 7. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me. A thorn in the flesh. Paul doesn't tell us exactly what it was. Some think it was a physical ailment, perhaps eye problems or recurring illness. Others suggest it was a person who constantly opposed him. Still others believe it was a spiritual attack. Paul leaves it vague, perhaps so anyone with their own thorn could relate. What we do know is that it tormented him. The Greek word means to strike with fists, to beat, to rough up. This wasn't a minor irritation. It was something that repeatedly knocked Paul down, something that caused real suffering. And Paul did what any of us would do. He asked God to take it away. Verse 8. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. 3 times. This wasn't a casual request. Paul pleaded, the man who had raised the dead, who had been stoned and left for dead only to get up and keep preaching, who had endured shipwrecks and beatings and imprisonment. This man begged God to remove this one thing. 3 times he came before the Lord. 3 times he laid out his case. Think about his arguments. Lord, I could serve you better without this. I could travel more, preach more, write more. This thorn is limiting my ministry. It's from Satan. Surely you don't want Satan's messenger tormenting your apostle. Please, take it away. The first time he prayed, heaven seemed silent. So he prayed again, perhaps with more intensity, more desperation. Still the thorn remained. A third time he came, possibly wondering if God was even listening. But then came the answer, though not the one Paul expected. Verse 9. But he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. God didn't say no. He didn't say not yet. He said something far more profound. My grace is sufficient for you. In other words, Paul, you're asking me to remove the very thing through which I'm showing my power in your life. You think you need the thorn removed? What you actually need is my grace, and the thorn is keeping you connected to that grace. My power is made perfect in weakness. The Greek word for perfect means complete, fully realized, achieving its goal. God's power reaches its full expression not through human strength, but through human weakness. The thorn wasn't hindering God's work through Paul, it was enabling it. This changed everything for Paul. Look at his response in the rest of verse 9. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. Paul went from pleading for removal to boasting about his weaknesses. That's not natural. Our instinct is to hide weakness, to project strength, to never let anyone see us struggle. But Paul discovered something revolutionary. His weaknesses were not obstacles to God's power, but channels for it, so that Christ's power may rest on me. The word rest here literally means to tent over, to tabernacle upon. Paul was saying that his weaknesses had become the camping ground for Christ's power. The very things he wanted gone had become the place where divine strength took up residence. Verse 10 shows how completely Paul's perspective had changed. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. He delighted in weaknesses. Not endured, not tolerated, but delighted. Insults that once would have stung now reminded him of his dependence on God. Hardships that would have discouraged him now drove him to divine resources. Persecutions that might have made him question his calling now confirmed Christ's power working through him. When I am weak, then I am strong. This is the paradox of surrender. Paul discovered that his moments of greatest weakness were actually his moments of greatest strength. because they were the moments when he relied entirely on God's power rather than his own. The thorn never went away. Paul carried it for the rest of his life. Every day he woke up with this messenger of Satan still tormenting him. But it had been transformed from a burden to a blessing, from a limitation to a liberation. Think about what Paul accomplished with this thorn. He planted churches across the Roman Empire. He wrote much of the New Testament. He brought the gospel to kings and rulers. He endured sufferings that would have destroyed most people. And he did it all while carrying this unnamed torment. The thorn forced Paul into continual dependence on God. Without it, Paul might have relied on his intelligence. He was brilliant. He might have depended on his training. He was taught by the best. He might have trusted in his revelations. He had seen heaven itself. But the thorn kept him humble, desperate, dependent. Paul's surrender wasn't a one-time event. Every day the thorn remained was another day of accepting God's sufficient grace instead of demanding removal. Every moment of torment was another opportunity to choose weakness so that Christ's power could be displayed. 3 different people, 3 different surrenders. Hannah surrendered her desperate desire for a child, releasing to God what she wanted most. Abraham surrendered his son, the promise incarnate, trusting God even when it made no sense. Paul surrendered to his limitation, accepting weakness as the pathway to divine strength. Each found that surrender didn't mean loss, it meant transformation. Hannah's release led to peace before her prayer was answered. Abraham's obedience revealed provision he couldn't have imagined. Paul's acceptance unlocked power that surpassed his own abilities. The surrender wasn't about giving up. It was about giving over. Not resignation, but release. Not defeat, but a different kind of victory. Each discovered that the white-knuckled grip of control was actually keeping them from receiving what God wanted to give. After recognizing our anxious hearts and learning to surrender control, we now discover something profound: the stillness where God's perfect peace dwells. This isn't just the absence of noise or activity. It's an active dwelling place where restoration happens. We'll explore David's lived experience of divine shepherding, Elijah's discovery that God speaks in whispers, not earthquakes, and Jesus' practice of seeking solitude before dawn. Each shows us that peace isn't found in fixing everything around us, but in finding the still place where God meets us. David knew what it meant to be hunted. Before he wrote Psalm 23, he had spent years running from King Saul, hiding in caves, sleeping in wilderness places where wild animals prowled. He had led men into battle, felt the weight of leadership, and experienced betrayal from those he trusted. Yet from this man who knew danger intimately came words of profound peace. The psalm begins with a declaration that changed everything. Psalm 23, verse 1, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing." David had been a shepherd boy himself. He knew what good shepherding meant: constant vigilance, fierce protection, gentle leading. He had fought lions and bears to protect his father's sheep. Now he recognized that same protective care over his own life. I lack nothing, not because David had everything, but because the shepherd provided what was needed. Verse 2 paints a picture of divine provision. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. Sheep won't lie down if they're hungry, frightened, or if there's friction in the flock. They only rest when they feel completely secure. David was saying that God had removed every reason for restlessness. The green pastures weren't just about food, they represented abundance in a desert land where green grass was rare and precious. He leads me beside quiet waters, literally, waters of rest. not rushing torrents that sheep fear, but calm pools where they can drink without anxiety. Sheep are easily frightened by running water. They need stillness to drink deeply. David knew God was leading him to places where his soul could actually receive refreshment, not just survive. Verse 3 continues, "He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake." The Hebrew word for refreshes means to return, to bring back, to restore to the original state. David's soul had been depleted by running, fighting, leading, surviving. But the shepherd knew how to bring him back to wholeness. This wasn't just rest. It was restoration. He guides me along the right paths, literally paths of righteousness. The shepherd wasn't just keeping David alive. He was keeping him on track morally and spiritually. Even when David couldn't see where the path led, he trusted the shepherd's direction. Then comes verse 4, perhaps the most famous. "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Notice David didn't say, "If I walk through the valley," but "even though I walk through." Valleys were inevitable. The path to green pastures often led through dangerous ravines where predators lurked in shadows. But David had discovered something crucial. He was walking through, not dwelling in, not dying in, but passing through. The darkest valley, literally, the valley of the shadow of death. This could mean death's shadow falling across the path, or it could mean the deepest darkness, like death's own shadow. Either way, it was the worst place imaginable. Yet David declared, "I will fear no evil." Why? "For you are with me." Not, "You will rescue me," or "You will remove the valley," but simply, "You are with me." The shepherd's presence changed everything about the valley. The shadows were still dark, the path still dangerous, but fear had lost its power because the shepherd was there. "Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." The rod was a weapon, a heavy club used to fight off predators. The staff was for guiding and rescuing. Its crook could pull a sheep from a crevice or direct it back to the path. Both tools meant the shepherd was equipped for whatever threatened or troubled the sheep. Then comes a sudden shift in the imagery. Verse 5. "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows." David moved from shepherd imagery to banquet imagery. But notice where this feast takes place. In the presence of my enemies. Not after the enemies were defeated, not in a safe place far from danger, but right there with enemies watching. In ancient Middle Eastern culture, to eat at someone's table meant you were under their protection. No one could harm you while you were their guest. David was painting a picture of God's protection so complete that he could sit and feast while those who wanted to destroy him could only watch. "You anoint my head with oil." This was what hosts did for honored guests. The oil-soothed skin dried by desert travel and marked the guest as specially welcomed. David felt not just protected, but honored, celebrated, valued by God, even while enemies surrounded him. "My cup overflows," not just full, but overflowing. More blessing than David could contain. Abundance that spilled over into the lives of others. This wasn't scarcity thinking where you carefully ration what little you have. This was overflow, excess, more than enough. The psalm concludes with future certainty. Verse 6. "Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Surely, no doubt, no question. Goodness and love will follow me. The Hebrew word for follow is actually aggressive, meaning to pursue, to chase. David was saying God's goodness and love were hunting him down, pursuing him relentlessly. The same intensity Saul had shown in hunting David to kill him, God was showing in pursuing David with blessing. All the days of my life, not just the good days, not just when things were peaceful, but every single day. The difficult days, the valley days, the enemy-surrounded days, all of them would be marked by pursuing goodness and love. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. David's ultimate desire wasn't just to visit God's presence, but to live there, to make his permanent home in that place of peace, not someday in the future, but as a present reality that would extend into eternity. David wrote this psalm not from a palace throne in peaceful times, but from lived experience of danger and deliverance. He had actually walked through death's shadow. He had actually been surrounded by enemies. He had actually experienced the restoration of soul he described. This wasn't theoretical theology. It was testimony. Elijah had just won the greatest victory of his prophetic ministry. On Mount Carmel, before all Israel, he had challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest. 2 altars, 2 sacrifices, and whichever God answered with fire would be recognized as the true God. The prophets of Baal had danced and shouted from morning until evening. They cut themselves with swords until blood flowed. But Baal was silent. Then Elijah rebuilt the Lord's altar, drenched his sacrifice with water 3 times until the trench around it was full, and prayed a simple prayer. Fire fell from heaven, consuming not just the sacrifice, but the stones, the soil, and even the water. The people fell on their faces, declaring, "The Lord, He is God." The prophets of Baal were destroyed. Then Elijah prayed, and the 3-year drought ended with a powerful rainstorm. It should have been the turning point for the nation. But when Queen Jezebel heard what had happened, she sent a message to Elijah. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 2 records her threat. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." After facing down 450 prophets and calling down fire from heaven, Elijah ran from one woman's threat. Verse 3 and 4 tell us, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." The mighty prophet who had just demonstrated God's power was now alone under a desert bush, asking to die. The crash after the mountaintop experience had left him depleted, discouraged, and desperate. He had given everything, and it seemed to have changed nothing. Jezebel was still in power. The people's declaration of faith seemed hollow. He felt like a failure. Verse 5 through 8 describe God's gentle care. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank, and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. God didn't lecture Elijah about his lack of faith. He didn't rebuke him for running. He sent an angel with food and water, let him sleep, then fed him again. Only after Elijah was physically restored did the journey continue. 40 days and nights to Mount Horeb, also called Sinai, the very mountain where God had appeared to Moses. Verse 9. There he went into a cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God knew exactly what Elijah was doing there, but he wanted Elijah to voice his struggle. Verse 10 shows Elijah's response. He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." Elijah felt alone, abandoned, like the last faithful person in a nation that had rejected God. Despite the victory at Carmel, he saw only failure. Despite the people's declaration, he felt isolated. His perspective had narrowed to his own fear and exhaustion. Then God did something unexpected. Verse 11 and 12. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. 3 dramatic displays of power, the kind of manifestations you'd expect from the God who had just sent fire from heaven. Wind so powerful it shattered rocks, an earthquake that shook the mountain. Fire, like what had consumed the sacrifice at Carmel. Each one announced with language suggesting God's presence was near. But God was not in any of them. The spectacular displays that everyone would notice, that no one could ignore, that would force acknowledgement. God wasn't in them. Elijah stood at the cave entrance watching these incredible demonstrations of power, waiting for God to speak from them. But they passed by in silence. Then verse 12 continues, "And after the fire came a gentle whisper." Other translations say, "a still small voice," or "a sound of gentle stillness." The Hebrew is difficult to translate. It literally means a voice of thin silence. It was barely there, easily missed, requiring complete attention to perceive. Verse 13. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah recognized God in the whisper. He covered his face in reverence and stepped out of the cave. The same God who could have spoken through wind, earthquake, or fire chose instead to speak in a whisper that required Elijah to be completely still to hear. Elijah repeated his complaint in verse 14, word for word. But now he was listening differently. God responded not with judgment, but with new instructions. Verse 15 through 17 gave him new work to do: anoint 2 kings and a successor prophet. Then verse 18 corrected his perspective. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him. Elijah wasn't alone. There were 7,000 others who had remained faithful. But Elijah couldn't see them from inside his cave of despair. He couldn't hear about them over the noise of his own fear. He had to encounter God in the whisper to gain true perspective. The wind, earthquake, and fire had been impressive but empty. They were displays of power without personal communication. But the whisper, that required relationship. You have to be close to someone to hear their whisper. You have to be quiet. You have to be paying attention. God could have boomed his message from the earthquake. He could have written it in fire across the sky. Instead, he whispered, inviting Elijah into intimacy that the dramatic displays couldn't provide. The spectacular manifestations might force acknowledgement, but the whisper invited relationship. Elijah had to leave his cave to fully hear the whisper. He had to step out of his hiding place, his defensive position, his isolation. The whisper drew him out in a way that wind, earthquake, and fire hadn't. It required his participation, his movement toward the voice. After encountering God in the whisper, Elijah returned to his mission. He anointed Hazael as king over Aram, Jehu as king over Israel, and Elisha as his prophetic successor. The man who had wanted to die under a bush became active again in God's purposes. The whisper had restored what the dramatic victory at Carmel hadn't sustained: Elijah's sense of purpose and connection to God. The day before had been extraordinary. Mark chapter 1 tells us Jesus had taught in the synagogue with authority that amazed everyone. He had cast out an evil spirit in front of the whole congregation. He had healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law of a fever. And then, as verse 32 and 33 describe, that evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door. Imagine that scene. The entire town crowded around one doorway. Every sick person, every troubled soul, every desperate parent with a suffering child. They had heard what happened in the synagogue. They had seen Peter's mother-in-law serving them, completely healed. Hope had exploded through the town like wildfire. Verse 34, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. Jesus worked late into the night. Each person who came received individual attention. Each healing was personal, specific, complete. By the time the last person left, Jesus had poured out tremendous spiritual and physical energy. Anyone else would have collapsed into exhausted sleep. But verse 35 tells us something remarkable. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Very early in the morning, the Greek indicates the fourth watch between 3 and 6 a.m. While it was still dark, before dawn, when the town was silent and still. After ministering probably past midnight, Jesus rose perhaps 3 or 4 hours later. He didn't wake anyone. He slipped out quietly, leaving the house where he'd been staying. He had to be intentional about finding solitude. It didn't happen accidentally. He had to leave before the crowds returned, before the disciples woke, before the demands of the day began. A solitary place. The Greek word means deserted, uninhabited, wilderness, not just a quiet corner of the house, but completely away from people. Jesus actively sought isolation, knowing that even his closest disciples would interrupt what he needed to do. Where he prayed. The Greek tense indicates continuous action. He kept on praying. This wasn't a quick prayer before starting the day. This was extended communion with the Father. Hours, perhaps, in the dark, alone, pouring out his heart and receiving direction. Think about what Jesus didn't do. He didn't sleep in after an exhausting night of ministry. He didn't call a planning meeting with the disciples to strategize about the crowds. He didn't immediately return to healing the endless line of needy people. He prioritized solitary prayer over everything else. Meanwhile, back at the house, people started waking up. Verse 36 and 37. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." The Greek word for "went to look for" actually means to hunt down, to track, to pursue earnestly. Peter and the others had to search for Jesus. He hadn't left word where he was going. They had to follow his tracks into the wilderness. "Everyone is looking for you." Peter's words carried urgency and perhaps frustration. The whole town had probably returned. More sick people had arrived. The disciples saw opportunity. Momentum was building. Crowds were gathering. This was the moment to establish Jesus' ministry in Capernaum. From a human perspective, Peter was right. When you have momentum, you capitalize on it. When crowds gather, you seize the opportunity. When people are responsive, you stay and build on that foundation. Walking away seemed like wasting the opportunity. But look at Jesus' response in verse 38. Jesus replied, Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." Jesus didn't return to the crowds. He didn't apologize for being away. He announced a completely different direction, leaving the responsive crowd in Capernaum to go to villages that hadn't heard him yet. The solitary prayer time had clarified his mission. That is why I have come. Jesus knew his purpose with crystal clarity. Not to become the resident healer of Capernaum, not to build the largest following in one place, but to spread the message throughout the region. This clarity came from the solitary place, from the pre-dawn prayer, from the communion with the Father that the disciples had interrupted. Verse 39. So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. The decision made in solitary prayer shaped the entire ministry that followed. Instead of staying where it was comfortable and successful, Jesus moved into new territory. The pattern that started that morning continued throughout his ministry. Luke chapter 5, verse 16 tells us, "But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed." This wasn't a one-time event. It was his regular practice. The more the crowds pressed in, the more Jesus pulled away to solitary places. The greater the demands, the more he prioritized solitude with the Father. Sometimes he prayed all night, as Luke 6:12 records before choosing the 12 apostles. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. Major decisions were made not in committee meetings, but in solitary communion with God. Even on his final night in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus sought solitude for prayer. Matthew 26:36 tells us he said to the disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." Then he went a little farther with Peter, James, and John, and finally, verse 39 says, "Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed." Layer by layer, Jesus removed himself from others to be alone with the Father. The most crucial moment of his earthly mission was prepared for in solitude. The decision to embrace the cross came from that solitary wrestling in prayer. Jesus never apologized for these withdrawals. He never explained to the crowds why he disappeared. He never justified to the disciples why he left successful situations. He knew that what happened in the solitary place determined everything that happened in public ministry. The disciples struggled to understand this. They saw the crowds as opportunity. They saw the momentum as something to maximize. They saw Jesus' withdrawals as interruptions to the real work. But Jesus saw the solitary prayer as the real work that made everything else possible. When they found him praying, their message was always about what he was missing, who was waiting, what opportunities were passing by. They thought stillness was wasted time. They thought solitude was avoiding responsibility. They didn't understand that the clarity, power, and direction for ministry came from those dark, silent hours alone with God. Jesus could have healed through the night and into the next day. There were certainly enough sick people. He could have taught continuously. The crowds were hungry for his words. He could have built a massive following in Capernaum that would have been the envy of any rabbi. But Jesus chose stillness over activity, solitude over crowds, prayer over productivity. He understood that ministering from emptiness would help no one. He knew that divine direction was more important than human opportunity. He recognized that communion with the Father wasn't preparation for ministry. It was the ministry from which everything else flowed. 3 different expressions of stillness. David found peace in the reality of God's shepherding presence even when surrounded by enemies. Elijah discovered God in a whisper that required complete stillness to hear. Jesus modeled the priority of solitary prayer over pressing crowds. Each teaches us that stillness isn't the absence of activity, but the presence of God. It's not about finding a quiet place, but about finding the God who speaks in quiet places. It's not escape from responsibility, but engagement with the source of strength for all responsibility. The green pastures and still waters aren't always physical locations. Sometimes they're moments of internal rest, while external chaos continues. The whisper of God often comes after the noise of our own efforts has exhausted itself. The solitary place might be rising early or staying late, but it requires intentional withdrawal from the urgent to encounter the important. If this message touched your heart today, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss future biblical reflections. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their anxiety can be transformed into peace through God's presence. Together, let's discover the stillness that comes not from the absence of problems, but from the presence of the Good Shepherd. Remember, you don't have to stay in the storm. Surrender is possible. Stillness is waiting. His peace is available right now. God bless you, and see you in the next video.